Now that our tooling process is complete, we can move back onto more exciting things like building more components. In this section, we're going to learn about the concept of state in React. What is state? State is a property on every React component that is used to record interactions with a user. So for example, let's imagine a drop-down widget. Drop-down being a button that we would click and then a list of items would appear underneath it. Normally the drop-down would be closed, and that's when you can't see a list of items. When the list of items is visible, the drop-down is open. We would use state to remember whether or not a user has clicked on the button, and so whether or not the drop-down should be open or closed. Now you might ask yourself, why do we need to record whether a drop-down is open or closed? Why can't we just kind of like make it happen? Why do we have to keep a record around? And the answer to that is that we design our components to be able to be re-rendered at any given time. And we're going to talk at length about that subject in a later section. Our drop-down component is, by default, normally closed. If we randomly re-render our component at any given time, like, for example, when the user has the drop-down open, then when a re-render happens, it'll revert to its normal state, which is to be closed. So kind of think it through that in your head real quick. If a user is using our application and they have a drop-down that is currently open, and let's say they tick some little checkbox on the right-hand side that causes everything on the page to be re-rendered, if we don't record the state of the drop-down, when we do the re-render, the drop-down will suddenly appear to be closed, and that could be really jarring to a user. So let's explore with some real code here that we're just going to put into a little sample file before we start writing some real code. Let's consider how state might work with a drop-down component. So I would have a render function, and the HTML for a drop-down might look a little something like this. I'll have a wrapper div. I'll have a button that says open, close, drop-down. And then I'll have my list of items. And I might have option number 1 and option number 2. Now I need to be able to hide or show this list of items right now, depending on whether or not this button has been clicked, right? So when the user clicks on this button, this UL should toggle its visibility. I'm going to do that by giving it a class name, and we'll just say that this will be stored in a variable called visible. So now, well, what is visible? We'll say if dropdown should be open, visible equals visible, else visible should be hidden. So if the dropdown should be open, the list will have a class name of visible. If the dropdown should be closed, then visible will have class hidden, the UL will have class hidden, and so in theory, this list of items would go away. The user would not be able to see it. And so that would kind of simulate opening and closing of a dropdown. So now our question is, well, how are we going to determine whether or not the dropdown should be open in a way that I can rerun this render function at any given time and be able to be confident that the state of the dropdown is not going to change. So if the user goes over here to some other area of our app, let's say that our dropdown is right here, user is over here, and they click on something over here that triggers a re-render of our dropdown, the dropdown isn't just going to mysteriously close all of a sudden. And we're going to do that by using state. So we're going to determine whether or not our dropdown should be open by saying this .state.dropdown open. So when dropdown open is true, will be visible. When it's false, will be hidden. Okay. So here's what this example shows us about state. It's going to be used to keep track of the user interaction. between re-renders of this component. And we do that through this .state. Before we jump in head first on how we're going to build this component, because we're actually going to build a dropdown here very shortly, let's try to plan out how we're going to do this in a little bit more detail. So in our browser, we're going to open up the Bootstrap documentation. So we'll go to getbootstrap.com. And then we're going to click on components at the and then on the right-hand side, dropdowns. And here's what our dropdown is going to look like. So we are going to copy paste some of the HTML in here. Notice that they have HTML in for two different examples. They have a drop up, which is this guy right here. So it's a drop down that, well, I suppose a drop up that opens upwards. But we're going to be making a drop down, which is just this top little list of HTML right here. So let's copy paste all of this. So I'm going to copy and then come back over and paste. And then for our purposes, we're just going to do a little bit of cleanup. We don't need a role on here right now. We don't need a tab index, and we don't actually need a link. We don't need any of these. There we go. So now we just have something that looks very similar to what we had a second ago. Div class dropdown, we have a button. The button has a little span tag in it, and then we have our list of items. So now that we have some sample HTML in here of kind of how we want our dropdown to be structured, we need to figure out what components or how we're going to componentize this to generate or to figure out what React components we need to create. So if we kind of think about this for a second, we have a button here, and our button has an icon on the right-hand side of it. Well, that's not at all unlike the badge component that we made much earlier. So we're going to cut this up a little bit just to plan out how we're going to build our dropdown. So rather than rendering like a full-on button here, we could instead just render a badge, right? Because our badge is basically a button with some text, and it has space in there for putting a little icon. In the case of our existing badge, it was a number, but we can make a couple changes to it very quickly to give it the same kind of effect, where it's a button with a little icon in it. Next, we have a list of items. Well, this list of items is basically just like our thumbnail list, right? So we're going to go back to our thumbnail list and borrow some ideas from it. And instead of making a thumbnail list, we'll make a unordered list. An unordered list is just going to know how to render a list of items as a UL instead of a very specialized thumbnail list. So now that we've got some structure in here, we're going to start off the next section by setting up all of our tooling. We'll really just copy pasting over our initial tooling. And then we're going to dive into figuring out how we're going to make this badge component and our unordered list. So just as a reminder, all we really did here was we kind of planned out how we're going to build our component, our dropdown. Well, the dropdown is really just a badge, a button, and then clicking on that badge is just going to show or hide this unordered list. So let's kick off the next section by figuring out how to make this unordered list.